History remembers its share of cruel, greedy, and violent kings, but only a handful of rulers have earned a reputation so disturbing that their names are still whispered in hushed tones centuries later. Tonight, we delve into the dark story of one such monarch, Ferdinand VII of Spain, a man whose legacy is drenched in fear, betrayal, and profound humiliation. He wasn't just another tyrant. He was something far more sinister, a king whose personal life was a tapestry of twisted desires, cruel obsessions, and behavior so shocking it horrified even those within his inner circle. Ferdinand came to power during a period of immense political chaos in Spain. The nation was reeling from the Napoleonic Wars, crying out for a leader to heal its wounds. Instead, Ferdinand turned the throne into a stage for his darkest impulses. He wasn't a unifier. He was a tormentor. Servants trembled at the sound of his footsteps. Ministers plotted ways to avoid his presence. Even his own wives were little more than prisoners, trapped in a gilded cage that felt more like a dungeon than a royal residence. His story is not just a tale of poor governance. It is a deep dive into the psyche of a man whose disturbed personality twisted the fate of an entire kingdom. This was a king who betrayed his own parents to seize power, who shamelessly begged foreign invaders for help, and who exacted brutal revenge on anyone who dared to dream of a more liberal Spain. But beyond the public cruelty lay a private life so perverse that many later historians were too scandalized to record the full details. So, how did Ferdinand VII earn the chilling title of the most perverted king in history? It wasn't about simple romantic scandals or political missteps. It was about the deeply disturbing way he treated the women in his life, the absolute power he abused for his own gratification, and the strange, dark rituals that echoed through the halls of his palace. This is the story of Ferdinand VII, and it's a journey into the heart of royal darkness. Ferdinand's story begins with an act of profound betrayal. His father, King Charles IV, was a well-meaning but weak ruler, largely controlled by his wife, Queen Maria Luisa, and her favored minister, Manuel Godoy. Young Ferdinand grew up in this environment of courtly intrigue, despising Godoy and, by extension, his own parents. He saw them as incompetent and corrupt, and he craved the crown for himself. His opportunity came when Napoleon Bonaparte's armies marched into Spain. Ferdinand saw a chance to seize power. He aligned himself with a faction of nobles who opposed Godoy and, in 1808, orchestrated a popular uprising known as the Tumult of Nero. This forced his father, Charles IV, to abdicate the throne. Ferdinand was king. His victory, however, was short-lived. Napoleon was not interested in a strong Spanish monarch. He lured both Ferdinand and his father to Bayonne, France, under the pretense of mediation. It was a trap. Once there, Napoleon forced both of them to renounce their claims to the Spanish throne. Ferdinand, the so-called desired one by his people, meekly complied. He spent the next 6 years as a pampered prisoner in a French chateau, writing fawning letters to Napoleon, even asking to be adopted into the Bonaparte family. While his people were fighting and dying in a brutal war of independence against the French, their king was busy trying to ingratiate himself with the enemy. When Napoleon was finally defeated in 1814, Ferdinand returned to Spain. The people rejoiced. They believed their desired king had come back to usher in a new era of freedom. The liberal government that had fought in his name had even drafted the Constitution of 1812, one of the most progressive in Europe at the time. They presented it to Ferdinand, expecting his approval. They were tragically mistaken. Ferdinand's first act upon returning to power was to abolish the Constitution. He declared it null and void, and then he unleashed a wave of terror. He rounded up the very liberals who had fought for his return, subjecting them to imprisonment, torture, and execution. He re-established the Spanish Inquisition, an institution of religious persecution that the rest of Europe had long since abandoned. He turned Spain back into an absolute monarchy, erasing every trace of progress. The desired one had become the felon king, but the political tyranny was only one side of Ferdinand's darkness. His personal life was a realm of even greater dysfunction, particularly his desperate and cruel quest for an heir. He married 4 times, and each marriage revealed more about his disturbing character. His first wife was his cousin, Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily. Their marriage was a battleground. She was intelligent and politically astute, and she despised Ferdinand for his weakness and duplicity. She openly defied him and his parents, forming her own political faction. Ferdinand, in turn, was rumored to be impotent, and their marriage was childless. Maria Antonia died suddenly, leading to widespread rumors that she had been poisoned, either by Queen Maria Louisa or by Ferdinand himself. While never proven, the suspicion hung over him for the rest of his life. His second wife was another cousin, Maria Isabel of Portugal. She was said to be gentle and kind, but her life with Ferdinand was a nightmare. She gave birth to a daughter who died in infancy. Then, during a second difficult pregnancy, she stopped breathing. The doctors, believing her to be dead, began to perform a cesarean section to save the baby. Tragically, Maria Isabel was not dead. She awoke during the horrifying procedure, letting out a scream of agony before dying from the shock and blood loss. The baby, a girl, was also stillborn. Ferdinand's reaction was not one of grief, but of cold frustration at his continued lack of an heir. This is where the story takes a truly bizarre turn. Disparate, for his son Ferdinand, was introduced to a peculiar practice by one of his courtiers. It was a form of ritualized stimulation involving his courtiers, and sometimes female servants. This was not a secret affair. It was a semi-public performance within the palace, designed to, in his mind, prepare him for conceiving an heir. The details are unsettling. Servants, and even high-ranking nobles, were forced to participate in these demeaning rituals, which became a source of both fear and ridicule within the court. It was a humiliating spectacle that showcased the king's obsessions and his complete disregard for the dignity of those around him. His third marriage, to Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, was perhaps the most tragic. She was a devoutly religious and sheltered young woman, completely terrified of the physical aspects of marriage. Ferdinand showed no patience or compassion. He viewed her only as a vessel for producing an heir. His crude and forceful attempts to consummate the marriage only intensified her terror. She would lock herself in her rooms, praying for deliverance. For years, the marriage remained Eventually, Pope Leo XII had to intervene, writing a personal letter to the Queen to convince her that fulfilling her marital duties was not a sin. She reluctantly complied, but the marriage remained childless, and she died a few years later, a broken and unhappy woman. Finally, at the age of 45, Ferdinand married his fourth wife, another niece, Maria Cristina of the two. She was much younger, but also much smarter and more politically savvy than his previous wives. She understood her role and her husband. She managed to navigate his difficult personality and finally gave him what he had so desperately wanted: children. However, they were both daughters, Isabella and Luisa Fernanda. The birth of his daughter, Isabella, created a massive political crisis. Spain's succession law at the time prevented females from inheriting the throne if there were other male relatives in the line of succession. This meant Ferdinand's heir was his deeply conservative and reactionary younger brother, Don Carlos. But Ferdinand, influenced by Maria Cristina, was determined for his own daughter to rule. In the final years of his life, he changed the law of succession to allow Isabella to become queen. This act, known as the Pragmatic Sanction of 1830, was Ferdinand's final betrayal. It enraged his brother and his supporters, the Carlists, who saw it as an illegal power grab. When Ferdinand died in 1833, his infant daughter Isabella II was declared queen, with her mother Maria Cristina as regent. Don Carlos immediately declared himself the rightful king, plunging Spain into a series of brutal civil wars. The Carlist wars that would bleed the country for decades. Ferdinand VII's legacy is one of utter devastation. He crushed liberalism, resurrected the Inquisition, and bankrupted the nation. During his reign, Spain lost almost all of its American colonies. His personal life was a grotesque theater of cruelty and obsession, where he tormented his wives and humiliated his court. His final act, changing the succession, was not born of progressive ideals, but of selfish vanity, and it sowed the seeds of a civil war that would haunt Spain for generations. He was a king who betrayed everyone: his parents, his people, his allies, and finally, his own brother. He left behind a country fractured, impoverished, and traumatized. The title Most Perverted King isn't just about his bizarre private rituals. It's about the complete perversion of the role of a monarch. Instead of a father to his people, he was their tormentor. Instead of a protector of the realm, he was its greatest saboteur. His reign stands as a chilling testament to how the dark, twisted psychology of a single individual can bring an entire nation to its knees. Thanks for watching. If you found this dive into the dark side of history compelling, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more stories from the shadows of the past. Have you ever wondered what happens when a royal family collapses from the inside? When a prince, instead of saving his kingdom, becomes its greatest threat? This is the story of Spain, right before one of its most notorious kings, Ferdinand VII, took power. And trust me, it's a drama filled with betrayal, ambition, and a nation on the brink of disaster. Before Ferdinand ever wore the crown, Spain was already a shadow of its former self. The country was weak, fractured, and led by a king who was completely out of his depth. This king was Charles IV, Ferdinand's father. Now, by all accounts, Charles was a decent man, kind-hearted even, but being a good person doesn't always make you a good leader. He struggled to navigate the treacherous political waters of Europe and leaned heavily onto people. His wife, Queen Maria Luisa, and her favorite government minister, Manuel Godoy. This is where things get messy. The relationship between the Queen and Godoy was the talk of. Many believed they were far too close, sparking scandalous rumors that spread like wildfire. Some whispered that Godoy was the real power behind the throne, manipulating the royal couple like a puppet master. Others claimed he was using his powerful position for his own personal pleasures, taking advantage of the Queen's favor. Now, whether these rumors were entirely true or just vicious gossip, it didn't really matter. The damage was done. They created a storm of distrust and resentment that swept across the entire country. And right in the middle of this storm was the young Prince Ferdinand. He grew up in a palace poisoned by scandal, watching as his own parents became figures of public hatred. Imagine that for a moment. The people you're meant to look up to, the king and queen, are despised by the very subjects they rule. This toxic environment didn't just shape Ferdinand's childhood. It planted a seed of resentment and ambition deep inside him. While Spain was imploding from within, a giant shadow was looming over Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte. He had conquered vast territories and was reshaping the continent in his image. Officially, Spain was Napoleon's ally, but it was a fragile and terrifying alliance. In reality, Spain was trapped. It was a pawn in Napoleon's grand game, caught between a forced loyalty and the constant fear of invasion. The Spanish people felt this humiliation keenly. The consequences for everyday Spaniards were devastating. The economy completely collapsed. With trade disrupted and the government in chaos, poverty skyrocketed. People were starving. The once mighty Spanish army was in shambles. Soldiers were poorly equipped, underfed, and their morale was at an all-time low. The nation was crying out for a savior, a strong, decisive leader who could restore Spain's pride and pull it back from the brink. This was Ferdinand's moment. The stage was set for him to step up, to be the hero his country desperately needed. He could have been the unifying force, the loyal son who supported his struggling father and rallied the people. But that's not what happened. Instead of seeing a nation in crisis, Ferdinand saw a golden opportunity for himself. It was young, deeply insecure, and consumed by a desperate hunger for power. Instead of defending his parents, he did the exact opposite. He joined the chorus of their critics. He fanned the flames of public anger, aligning himself with the very people who despised his family. He calculated that their downfall would be his stepping stone to the throne. He chose to ride the wave of popular hatred, hoping it would carry him straight to the crown. Think about the irony. Spain was craving stability, unity, and strength. What it got was a prince poisoned by jealousy, a son ready to betray his own blood for a taste of power. He wasn't thinking about Spain's future. He was fixated on his own. This environment of political weakness, courtly scandal, and family drama was the crucible that forged Ferdinand. It fed the darkness criterios, nurturing his ambition and paranoia. It was preparing him for a future where his personal demons wouldn't just destroy his family, but would also dictate the fate of an entire nation. The tragedy wasn't just that Spain was broken, it was that the man who was supposed to fix it was more broken than the kingdom itself. And this is just the beginning of the story. The events that followed would plunge Spain into one of the most turbulent periods in its history, with Ferdinand at the very center of the chaos. The seeds of betrayal he planted would soon bear bitter fruit for him and for all of Spain. What he did next would cement his legacy as one of history's most controversial monarchs. Thanks for watching. If you're fascinated by the dramatic twists and turns of history, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the past. See you in the next video. Imagine a childhood not filled with laughter and love, but with whispers, shadows, and the cold weight of a crown you're not yet meant to wear. This was the world of young Ferdinand, the future king of Spain. His playground wasn't a garden. It was the gilded cage of the royal palace of Madrid, a place teeming with secrets, gossip, and the silent, brutal battles of politics. While other children learned to trust, Ferdinand learned to suspect. While they received guidance, he learned the art of manipulation. From the very beginning, his life was defined by a profound sense of insecurity. He looked at his mother, Queen Maria Luisa, and didn't see a loving parent. Instead, he saw a woman whose attention seemed fixated on one man, Manuel Godoy, the prime minister. To the young prince, Godoy was a rival, a thief who had stolen his mother's affection. Whether this was the absolute truth or a child's distorted perception, it didn't matter. The feeling of being second best, of being less important than a court favorite, planted a seed of deep, abiding resentment that would poison his soul for the rest of his life. Then there was his father, King Charles IV. Ferdinand saw him not as a strong, admirable figure, but as a weak-willed ruler, his allies swayed and controlled by others, especially by Godoy. And the queen? The prince felt utterly ignored, a footnote in his own family's story. This wasn't just a feeling of being left out, it was a profound emotional isolation that gnawed at him daily. Every whispered conversation he overheard, every secret glance between his parents and Godoy reinforced his belief that he was an outsider, unimportant and overshadowed. This constant state of emotional neglect didn't make him sad. It made him bitter. It turned his heart to stone. Those who worked in the palace saw the effects of this toxic environment firsthand. They described a boy who was almost ghost-like. He would glide through the grand hallways, avoiding eye contact, his gaze perpetually fixed on the floor. He rarely, if ever, smiled. When he spoke, it wasn't in the clear, confident voice of a future king, but in hushed whispers, as if sharing a secret or plotting a conspiracy. He was a watcher. His eyes would follow people with an unnerving intensity, scrutinizing their every move, as if he was convinced they were all lying to him, all part of some grand deception at his expense. In Tiswold, he came to believe that affection was a tool, a trap used to gain an advantage. This upbringing forged a personality riddled with contradictions. He desperately craved love, but was terrified of intimacy, pushing away anyone who got too close. He yearned for power, for the control he felt he never had, yet he was paralyzed by a feeling of complete powerlessness. He demanded respect, but the only way he knew how to get it was through cruelty and intimidation. He was a paradox, a prince who wanted to be a king but had the soul of a prisoner. As Ferdinand entered his teenage years, these deep-seated issues began to manifest in truly strange and disturbing habits. He would retreat from the light, isolating himself for hours in darkened rooms, shutting out the world. His habit of watching people intensified. Servants would grow deeply uncomfortable under his quiet, persistent stare. It wasn't curiosity. It was a cold, clinical observation that made them feel like insects under a magnifying glass. He was showing early, alarming signs of obsession and a desperate need for control. His behavior toward women was particularly unsettling. He would follow ladies of the court through the palace corridors, but not with any hint of youthful romance or flirtation. His pursuit was silent, his gaze cold and possessive. It was an act of surveillance, of asserting a strange dominance that chilled those on the receiving end. He seemed to view them not as people, but as objects to be watched and catalogued. This wasn't a prince learning about courtship. This was a predator learning his territory. Akademikaji. He was a disaster. His tutors despaired. He showed a profound resistance to learning, pushing away books and formal education. Why bother with history or philosophy when the real lessons were in the palace corridors? He preferred rumors over facts, suspicion over knowledge. The intricate web of court intrigue was his real university. He learned about power not from Machiavelli's writings, but from watching Gaudia's rise. He learned about human nature not from the great philosophers, but from the petty jealousies and betrayals he witnessed every single day. These troubling traits didn't fade as he approached adulthood. They grew stronger, deeper, and more ingrained in his very being. The insecurity of the boy became the paranoia of the man. The bitterness of the neglected son became the cruelty of the future monarch. The whispers in the palace halls became the silent, menacing presence he carried with him everywhere. By the time he was a young man, poised to inherit a kingdom, the damage was done. Ferdinand was no longer just a troubled prince. He was a deeply fractured individual, emotionally stunted, consumed by insecurity, and driven by a toxic mix of jealousy and a thirst for vengeance. The boy who avoided eye contact and whispered in the shadows was now ready to step into the light, not as a beacon of hope for Spain, but as a harbinger of darkness. The disturbing tendencies nurtured in the poisonous soil of his childhood were about to be unleashed upon an entire nation, shaping him into one of history's most problematic and tyrannical kings. The story of his reign of terror really begins here, into the lonely, fearful heart of a boy who was never taught how to love. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this deep dive into the dark psychology of a future king interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories from history. We'll see you in the next one. Ferdinand's hunger for the throne grew stronger with each passing year. He was the heir, Prince of Asturias. But for him, waiting wasn't an option. Patience was a virtue he simply didn't possess. Instead of biding his time, learning the ropes of statecraft, he chose a much darker, much quicker path. Betrayal. He began a secret correspondence, a series of clandestine letters sent not to an ally of Spain, but to its greatest threat, Napoleon Bonaparte. In these letters, Ferdinand laid his ambition bare. He practically begged Napoleon for support to overthrow his own father, King Charles IV. The words he used were venomous. He painted his father as a weak, incompetent fool, completely under the thumb of the despised Prime Minister, Manuel Godoy. He didn't spare his mother, Queen Maria Luisa, either, accusing her of all sorts of scandalous behavior and blaming her for the country's woes. In exchange for Napoleon's help in seizing the crown, Ferdinand promised a new Spain, a Spain loyal to the French emperor. He was selling out his family, his country, and his future subjects, all for the taste of power. It was a gamble of epic proportions, and it blew up in his face. Inevitably, the letters were discovered. The royal palace at El Escorial was thrown into absolute chaos. Imagine the scene. The aging king, Charles IV, presented with undeniable proof that his own son, his heir, was plotting to dethrone him. The shock, the heartbreak, the sheer disbelief must have been overwhelming. The queen was devastated, and the royal court was furious. This wasn't just a family squabble. It was high treason. Ferdinand was arrested, and for a moment, it seemed his ambitions were dead in the water. But this is where we get the first real glimpse of the man he truly was. Faced with the evidence, did he confess? Did he show remorse? Not at all. Ferdinand played the victim. He shed crocodile tears, claiming he had been manipulated, that he was a poor, naive prince, led astray by wicked advisors. He threw everyone he could under the bus, naming names and blaming anyone and everyone except himself. It was a masterful performance of deceit. And here's the truly astonishing part. Many people in Spain believed him. They bought the whole act. You see, public hatred for the Prime Minister, Godoy, was so intense that any enemy of Godoy was seen as a friend of the people. They saw Ferdinand not as a traitor, but as a patriot, a brave prince trying to save Spain from a corrupt government. They called him El Decido, the Desired One. They held rallies, They wrote pamphlets, all in support of the very man who had just tried to sell them out to a foreign power. They had no idea about the monster they were helping to create. This popular support, born of ignorance, saved Ferdinand. His father, facing immense public pressure, pardoned him. A fatal mistake. Ferdinand had learned a valuable lesson, but not the one you'd hope for. He didn't learn about loyalty or honor. He learned that he could lie, cheat, and betray, and as long as he maintained his public image as the people's prince, he could get away with it. His ambition didn't fade, it intensified. A few months later, he got his second chance. A popular uprising, the tumult of Aranjuez, forced his father to fire Godoy. The crowd whipped into a frenzy of support for Ferdinand, then surrounded the royal palace under immense Dudas Charles IV. Finally abdicated the throne. On March 19, 1808, Ferdinand's ultimate dream came true. He was now King Ferdinand VII of Spain. But Napoleon was playing a much longer, much more cunning game. He had been watching this family drama unfold with great interest, using it to his advantage. He never intended to help Ferdinand. He intended to swallow Spain whole. With the Spanish royal family in complete disarray, Napoleon made his move. He refused to officially recognize Ferdinand as king. Instead, he lured the entire royal family to the French city of Bayonne, supposedly to mediate their dispute. It was a trap, and they walked right into it. First Ferdinand, eager for Napoleon's official blessing, made the journey. Then, under pressure from the French, his parents followed. Once they were all on French soil, far from their armies and their people, the doors slammed shut. Napoleon revealed his true intentions. Under immense psychological pressure and outright threats, both Charles IV and his son, Ferdinand Septimo, were forced to renounce their claims to the Spanish throne. They signed away their kingdom. This moment should have been the end of Ferdinand's political life. A disgraced prince, a failed king now, a prisoner in a French chateau. His story should have ended there, a footnote in the history of the Napoleonic Wars. But Fatande's own ruthless, unyielding obsession with Pau had other plans. While he was in exile, the Spanish people rose up against the French. The very people he had betrayed now fought and died in his name, seeing him as a martyr king. They waged a brutal 6-year war of independence, all for the return of El Decido. And eventually, he would return. When Napoleon's empire began to crumble, Ferdinand was allowed to go back to Spain. The people rejoiced. They expected the return of their savior, the king who would bring liberty and a modern constitution that had been written in his absence. But the man who returned was not the hero they had imagined. The years in exile had not taught him wisdom or humility. They had hardened him, crystallizing his worst instincts. He returned with a heart full of vengeance and a mind committed to absolute power. He brought with him not leadership, not reform, but the darkest version of himself, ready to unleash a new era of tyranny upon the very people who had fought so bravely to bring him home. His tragic story was only just beginning. Thank you for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden corners of history. See you next time. Have you ever heard of a hero who turned into a monster overnight? This is the story of Ferdinand VII of Spain, a king whose return from exile was supposed to be a triumph, but became a national nightmare. It's a tale of hope, betrayal, and a ruler whose personal demons plunged an entire country into darkness. When Napoleon's empire crumbled in 1814, Spain rejoiced. Their king, Ferdinand, held captive in France for 6 long years, was finally coming home. The people poured into the streets, celebrating what they believed was the dawn of a new era. They saw him as El Decido, the desired one, the symbol of their resistance against foreign invaders. They imagined a future of freedom, guided by the liberal constitution they had created in his absence, a document that promised rights, representation, and an end to absolute monarchy. They were so wrong. The cheers had barely faded when Ferdinand showed his true colors. Within days of setting foot back on Spanish soil, he made a decision that would define his reign. He issued a decree, not to thank his people, but to destroy their dreams. He declared the Constitution of 1812 null and void. Who's like that, with the stroke of a pen? Every guarantee of liberty, every check on royal power, was wiped away. Free speech was outlawed. Political parties were banned. The press was muzzled. Spain wasn't being liberated. It was being reshackled, this time by its own king. What followed was a brutal, systematic purge. The very people who had fought for Spain as freedom and drafted its first constitution became the primary targets. Liberals, intellectuals, reformers, anyone associated with the new ideas of democracies, was now an enemy of the state. Ferdinand's soldiers, once hailed as heroes, became instruments of terror. They conducted nighttime raids, dragging men from their homes in front of their terrified families. The prisons filled up with poets, professors, and politicians. The infamous torture chambers of the Inquisition, which had been shut down during the French occupation, were reopened and put back to use. The message was clear and terrifying. Dissent would not be tolerated. Thinking differently was a crime. Ferdinand ruled with the paranoia of a man convinced that everyone was a threat. He wasn't just a king. He was an absolute autocrat who demanded total, unquestioning obedience. His own ministers lived in constant fear. Those who dared to offer advice that contradicted his views would simply disappear, their careers, and sometimes their lives ending abruptly. Writers who had once celebrated his return were thrown into dungeons for publishing articles he disliked. Even women were not spared. Those suspected of holding liberal sympathies or hosting political discussions were arrested and subjected to humiliating interrogations. The royal palace, which should have been a symbol of national pride, became the epicenter of this web of fear and suspicion. But Ferdinand's public tyranny was only one side of the coin. Behind the closed doors of the palace, his personality was even more disturbed. He treated his servants, not as employees, but as personal property, to be used and discarded at will. He was known for his crude and cruel humor, often singling out courtiers for public humiliation. He took a sadistic pleasure in the discomfort of others. The women who worked in the palace corridors walked in fear of his unwanted advances and his volatile temper. He cultivated an atmosphere of intense paranoia, turning his staff against one another. Loyalty wasn't earned through respect. It was commanded through intimidation. He wanted to be feared, not loved. Let's take a step back and think about the sheer psychological shock of this. Imagine fighting a brutal war for years to restore your king, only to have him turn around and declare you the enemy. The Spanish people had expected a savior, a leader who would heal the wounds of war and guide them into a brighter future. Instead, they got a tyrant whose disturbed mind and deep-seated insecurities shaped every law, every decree, and every punishment. The country was not just suffering from political oppression, it was being held hostage by the personal pathologies of its ruler. And as we'll see, the darkness that defined his public life was rooted in a private life that was even more unsettling and bizarre. Ferdinand's personal life was a mess of failed marriages, desperate attempts to produce an heir, and deep-seated psychological issues. His first 3 marriages were childless, a fact that haunted him and destabilized the monarchy. He was notoriously unfaithful, yet obsessed with his wife's fidelity. This obsession led to a strange and controlling behavior. For example, with his 4th wife, Maria Cristina, he insisted on being present for every single one of her doctor's appointments. He trusted no one. This desperate need for an heir wasn't just about continuing his lineage. It was about securing his power against his own brother, Carlos, who led a faction of ultra-royalists who thought Ferdinand wasn't conservative enough. The court of Ferdinand VII was a bizarre theater of contradictions. On one hand, it was suffocatingly formal and rigid, governed by ancient Spanish etiquette. On the other hand, it was run by the king's inner circle of cronies and sycophants, known as the Camarilla. This was not a cabinet of skilled statesmen. It was a shadow government of flatterers, opportunists, and old drinking buddies who had the king's ear. They influenced appointments, sold favors, and enriched themselves while the country's economy floundered. Major decisions of state were often made not in the council chamber, but in informal late-night gatherings filled with gossip and personal grievances. It was a government run on whims, not on wisdom. The economic consequences of this misrule were catastrophic. While Ferdinand was busy hunting down liberals and indulging his paranoia, Spain was falling apart. The long wars had drained the treasury, and now, across the Atlantic, Spain's American colonies, inspired by the very liberal ideas Ferdinand was crushing at home, were fighting for and winning their independence. This was a devastating blow. The colonies had been the primary source of the Spanish crown's wealth for centuries. Their loss meant the river of silver and gold that had propped up the monarchy was drying up. The economy collapsed. Poverty was rampant, but Ferdinand and his Camarilla seemed either unable or unwilling to address the crisis. Their focus remained on political repression. But the Spanish people were not so easily broken. In 1820, a military uprising led by a commander named Rafael del Rigo forced Ferdinand to back down. The soldiers, who were about to be sent to South America to fight a losing war, revolted. The rebellion spread like wildfire. Cornered and afraid, Ferdinand was forced to restore the 1812 Constitution. He famously declared, "Let us march, frankly, and die." Along the constitutional path, it was a lie. For the next 3 years, during a period known as the Trienio Liberal, Ferdinand played the part of a constitutional monarch while secretly plotting his revenge. He wrote desperate letters to the other conservative monarchies of Europe, begging them to invade Spain and restore his absolute power. His pleas were answered. In 1823, a massive French army, with the blessing of the other European powers, marched into Spain to crush the liberal government. The Spanish resistance, weakened by internal divisions, quickly crumbled. This time, when Ferdinand was restored to absolute power, there was no mercy. The decade that followed is known in Spanish history as the Ominos Decade. It was even more brutal than his first period of rule. The purges were wider, the punishments harsher. Rigo, the hero of the 1820 revolt, was captured and executed in a particularly cruel manner. He was dragged through the streets of Madrid in a basket before being hanged and quartered. Thousands more were executed, imprisoned, or forced into exile. Universities were closed for years, seen as breeding grounds for liberal thought. It was a reign of terror designed to extinguish the flame of enlightenment in Spain for good. As Ferdinand grew older and sicker, the question of succession became an all-consuming crisis. He had only managed to have children with his fourth wife, 2 daughters. But traditional Spanish law, the Salic law, barred females from the throne if there were male relatives in the line of succession. This meant his brother, the ultra-conservative Carlos, was his legal heir. Ferdinand knew that if Carlos became king, his own daughters would likely be cast aside. In a moment of desperation, he changed the succession law to allow his infant daughter, Isabella, to become queen. This act, done to protect his own children, split the country in two. On one side were the Isabelinos, who supported the young queen and, ironically, allied themselves with the surviving liberals. On the other were the Carlists, who championed Don Carlos and the cause of absolute monarchy and religious fundamentalism. Ferdinand VII died in 1833, but the poison he had injected into Spanish politics lived on. His death immediately triggered the First Carlist War, a brutal civil war that tore Spain apart for 7 years. This conflict was just the first of a series of Carlist wars that would plague Spain for the rest of the 19th century. Ferdinand's legacy was not one of strength or stability, but of chaos, division, and decades of civil strife. He had inherited a nation and left behind a battlefield. He wasn't the desired one. He became the felon king. He is remembered not as a savior but as one of the worst monarchs in Spanish history, a ruler whose personal flaws and political cruelty set his country on a path of conflict and decline that would last for generations. The story of Ferdinand VII is a chilling reminder of how the return of a hero can become the beginning of a horror story, and how the mind of a single man can shape the destiny of millions. Thank you for watching. If you found this dive into the dark reign of Ferdinand VII interesting, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories from the hidden corners of history. Let us know in the comments what other historical figures you'd like us to cover. See you in the next video. Behind the grand portraits and royal titles of Ferdinand VII of Spain hid a personality so disturbing it turned the palace into a prison. He wasn't just a king, he was a master of control, a man whose private life was a tapestry of jealousy, emotional instability, and a chilling obsession with obedience. To him, a wife was not a partner, but a silent prisoner, a possession to be controlled down to her very breath. Imagine living with someone who could be your friend one moment and an enraged tyrant the next, all over something as small as a misplaced book. This was the daily reality for those around Ferdinand. Servants learned to become ghosts, tiptoeing through the halls, terrified of triggering his explosive anger. His mood swings were legendary, and his desire for control was absolute. He dictated every aspect of his wives' lives, their daily routines, how they spoke, how they sat, even how they walked. He demanded absolute purity, yet took a twisted pleasure in shaming and humiliating them, using his authority to crush their spirits. His disturbing habits went even further. Eyewitness accounts from the time describe how Ferdinand would spend hours observing the women of the palace, not with affection, but with a cold, unsettling curiosity. He treated them as objects for his entertainment, forcing them into degrading positions of servitude, stripping them of their humanity piece by piece. Historians describe his desires as deeply unhealthy and obsessive, a constant test of loyalty that crossed every line of decency. For the women he married, this wasn't just a difficult marriage, it was a living nightmare. Ferdinand married 4 times, and each of his wives stepped into this nightmare, one after another. Their stories are a heartbreaking chronicle of suffering under his rule. His first wife was Maria Antonia of Naples. And Sicily? She was vibrant, intelligent, and full of life. Everything Ferdinand despised in a woman. He saw her confidence not as a strength, but as a direct challenge to his authority. From the beginning, he set out to break her. He subjected her to public humiliation, spied on her every move, and even spread vicious rumors to isolate her from her allies. The constant stress and suffocating atmosphere of the palace took a devastating toll. Her health collapsed, and she died young, at just 21. Whispers filled the court, whispers that her death was no accident of illness, but the direct result of the misery and poison of her marriage. Next came his niece, Maria Isabel of Portugal. She was gentle, innocent, and entered the marriage with a heart full of hope, believing she could be the queen her people needed. Ferdinand saw her innocence not as something to cherish, but as a blank canvas on which to paint his masterpiece of control. He systematically dismantled her spirit. He trapped her in a rigid schedule, turning her days into a monotonous cycle of obedience. She was a queen in name only. In reality, she was a captive in her own home. Her hope withered, replaced by fear and despair. Maria Isabel died tragically during a complicated childbirth. Once again, the court whispered that the constant stress and terror she endured had weakened her body, contributing to her untimely death. Ferdinand's third wife was Maria Josepha, Amalia of Saxony. She was just a teenager, a girl of 16 thrust into the clutches of a man almost twice her age. Her youth and innocence made her an easy target for his manipulative games. Ferdinand imposed his harshest rules, yet upon her isolating her completely. She was forbidden from forming friendships. Her letters were read, and her every action was scrutinized. She became a silent shadow in the palace, a ghost haunted by loneliness and fear. Trapped and emotionally destroyed, her health failed. Maria Josepha Amalia died at the age of 25, having known little more than a life of gilded imprisonment. Finally, there was his fourth wife, another niece, Maria Cristina of the two. She was different from the others. She possessed a stronger will and, at times, dared to push back against his suffocating control. But even her strength was no match for the darkness that permeated the palace. Ferdinand delighted in finding new ways to humiliate her, treating her with a cold, calculated cruelty designed to remind her who was in charge. She endured his abuse, walking a tightrope of survival every single day. Her story has a different ending, not because she escaped, but because he died first. Maria Cristina outlived him, finally freed from his tyrannical grip. The stories of these 4 women paint a chilling portrait of life with Ferdinand VII. Behind the closed doors of the royal palace, they cried, they suffered, and they prayed for an escape that, for most of them, only came in death. Their lives serve as a dark reminder that a crown offers no protection from a monster. Thanks for watching. If you found this glimpse into the dark side of history fascinating, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more stories from the shadows of the past. In the heart of the kingdom, nestled within the grand walls of the royal palace, a shadow lingered long after the sun had set. This wasn't a tale of ghosts or ancient curses, but of a king whose mind had become a far more terrifying place. During the reign of King Ferdinand, the very stones of the palace seemed to absorb the fear that permeated its halls. These servants, who saw everything, spoke in hushed whispers of the king's strange late-night rituals. They spoke of a man who ruled by day and haunted his own home by night. Ferdinand was a phantom in his own palace. He would roam the corridors at the most peculiar hours, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He'd appear in rooms unexpectedly, a silent specter, startling the staff and sending a chill down their spines. It wasn't just his presence that was unsettling. It was his unpredictability. No one ever knew where he would be, or what mood he would be in. This constant uncertainty created an atmosphere of pure dread, turning the royal residence from a place of prestige into a labyrinth of anxiety. His cruelty was not just a matter of policy, it was deeply personal. Ferdinand treated the women of the palace not as individuals, but as objects for his amusement and validation. He forced them into humiliating displays of loyalty, demanding they perform demeaning acts simply to prove their devotion. These weren't ceremonies of state. They were twisted games designed to break their spirit and assert his dominance. Some nights, the grand halls were transformed into a dark theater, where he demanded bizarre and unsettling entertainments that left everyone feeling violated and disturbed. The palace, once a symbol of national pride, now felt like the stage for a madman's private play. As his obsessions grew, so did his paranoia. Ferdinand became a king of secrets and locked doors. He would seal off entire sections of the palace for reasons known only to him. He hid personal objects, convinced that spies were lurking around every corner, ready to steal his secrets or exploit his weaknesses. He maintained strange, hidden collections that only a select few were ever allowed to see, and those who did never spoke of what they witnessed. The servants whispered about these secret gatherings, where the king would convene with his most trusted confidants. The stories that leaked out were fragmented and terrifying, describing behavior so disturbing that those who knew were too afraid to speak, and those who didn't were too afraid to ask. The fear was not confined to the servants' quarters. It reached the highest levels of government. Ministers, once eager for an audience with their sovereign, began to actively avoid nighttime meetings. They knew that Ferdinand's mood grew darker with the setting sun. The guards, sworn to protect the king, would exchange nervous glances as his strange, chilling laughter echoed through the empty corridors late at night. It was a sound devoid of joy, filled only with a menacing emptiness that made the palace feel profoundly, deeply haunted. Many came to believe that the king's own twisted personality had poisoned the very air, turning the royal home into a place of dark, lingering memories. As the years wore on, Ferdinand's reign of terror took a toll on his own body. As he aged, his physical health began to collapse. He became frail, his steps unsteady, his breath labored. But as his body weakened, his cruelty only grew sharper, more potent, as if all his remaining energy was being channeled into malice. His paranoia escalated to new heights. He saw enemies in every shadow, conspiracies in every whisper. His control became absolute, his actions more unpredictable than ever before. He was a sick king trapped inside a sick palace, and he was determined to drag everyone down with him. The servants' descriptions of him in his final years paint a grim picture. He would spend long, agonizing hours alone, lost in a labyrinth of disturbing thoughts. His mind was a prison, and he was its sole, tormented inmate. His marriage, already strained by his cruelty, completely disintegrated. The queen became a ghost in her own home, a silent witness to her husband's descent. The once lively court fell into a suffocating silence. Laughter was a forgotten sound. Ministers, terrified of provoking his wrath, stopped offering advice. The slightest disagreement, even a well-intentioned correction, could lead to brutal punishments. Fear was the only language the king understood anymore. His physical decay only fueled his anger. He raged against his own mortality, against the weakness of his flesh. He turned away from medicine and reason, relying instead on dark rituals and superstitions. He surrounded himself with mystics and soothsayers who fed his paranoia, confirming his darkest fears. He became convinced that traitors surrounded him, plotting his downfall. In his delusion, he accused innocent people of betrayal, their lives ruined by the whims of a dying tyrant. The palace itself seemed to be dying with him. It felt like a decaying organism, infected by the king's fear, his hatred, and his all-consuming obsessions. The story of King Ferdinand serves as a chilling reminder of how a single person's darkness can poison everything around them. His palace wasn't haunted by spirits, but by the living nightmare of his own creation. It's a tale of power, paranoia, and the terrifying decay of a human mind. What do you think happens to a kingdom when its leader loses their grip on reality? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and if you found this story fascinating, be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden corners of history. When King Ferdinand VII of Spain finally died in 1833, the nation didn't mourn. There were no widespread tears or outpourings of grief. Instead, a quiet wave of relief washed over a country that had endured years of fear, humiliation, and decline under his rule. He left behind a legacy of division and exhaustion, a kingdom fractured by his own choices. His death should have been a fresh start, but even the succession of his infant daughter, Isabella II, was immediately plunged into a bloody civil war, a direct consequence of her father's political maneuvering. Historians don't look back on Ferdinand VII as a great leader or even a competent one. They see him as a deeply unsettling figure, a man whose personal darkness cast a long shadow over everything he touched. His cruelty wasn't just political. It seeped into his personal life, shaping his marriages and turning them into instruments of his will. His profound insecurity dictated his politics, leading him to persecute liberals, reverse progress, and isolate Spain on the international stage. His strange and disturbing obsessions dictated life within the palace walls, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and dread. This toxic combination of traits earned him a chilling and unforgettable title, the most perverted king in history. Now, this title doesn't come from grand public scandals or debaucheries that you might read about with other monarchs. Ferdinand's perversion was something far more insidious. It was the silent suffering he inflicted on those closest to him, the private humiliation he reveled in, and the suffocating, toxic environment he cultivated within the closed doors of the royal palace of Madrid. His story is a dark chapter in history, often overlooked and rarely told in its entirety. It's a tale of a king whose personal demons became his nation's nightmare. So, how did Ferdinand VII become this monstrous figure? Let's go back to the beginning. Born in 1784, Ferdinand was the heir to the Spanish throne, but his childhood was far from idyllic. He grew up in a court riddled with intrigue and betrayal. His own mother, Queen Maria Luisa, was openly having an affair with the Prime Minister, Manuel Godoy. Young Ferdinand watched as Godoy, a man he despised, effectively controlled the kingdom and held more influence over his parents than he did. This bred a deep-seated resentment and a simmering rage within the young prince. He felt powerless, sidelined, and humiliated in his own home. He channeled this bitterness into plotting against his own father, King Charles IV. His first attempt to seize power, known as the Conspiracy of El Escorial, was a miserable failure. He was coward, and in a moment that would define his character, he immediately betrayed all of his co-conspirators to save himself. It was a cowardly act, but it worked. He was forgiven, while his allies were punished. This early lesson taught him that betrayal was a tool for survival. His moment to rule finally came in 1808, but it was under the shadow of another, far greater power, Napoleon Bonaparte. Ferdinand managed to force his father's abdication and claimed the throne, but his victory was short-lived. Napoleon, who saw Spain as a pawn in his European chess game, tricked Ferdinand into a meeting in Bayeux, France. There, the newly crowned king was forced to abdicate himself and became Napoleon's prisoner for the next 6 years. While Ferdinand was in luxurious exile, his people were fighting and dying for him. The Spanish rose up against French occupation in a brutal conflict known as the Peninsular War. They fought in his name, idealizing him as El Decido, the desired one. They drafted a new, liberal constitution in 1812, dreaming of a modern, constitutional monarchy with Ferdinand as its head. They believed he would return as a savior who would embrace this new era of freedom. They could not have been more wrong. When Ferdinand finally returned to Spain in 1814, his people celebrated. They had won the war, and their desired king was back. But Ferdinand had no intention of being a constitutional monarch. The moment he had a loyal general by his side, he made his move. He declared the 1812 constitution null and void, tore it up, and unleashed a brutal wave of repression. He arrested and executed the very liberals who had fought for his return. He re-established the absolute monarchy and the dreaded Spanish Inquisition. His first act as the restored king was to betray the hopes of his entire nation. The savior had returned as a tyrant. This period became known as the Sexenni Absolutista, or the 6 Absolutist years, a time of terror where anyone suspected of liberal sympathies was persecuted. The country, already devastated by war, was now plunged into political darkness. But it was within the palace walls where Ferdinand's most disturbing traits truly manifested, especially in his marriages. He needed an heir, but his personal life was a catalogue of tragedy and cruelty. His first wife, Maria Antonia of Naples, died before he became king, and rumors, though unproven, swirled that she was poisoned. After his restoration, he married his own niece, Maria Isabel of Portugal. Their marriage was brief and tragic. She died horribly during a botched cesarean section while giving birth to a stillborn daughter. The doctors, believing she was already dead, began to operate, only for her to scream in agony before dying from the shock and blood loss. The entire ordeal was a gruesome spectacle that highlighted the medical incompetence of the era. Desperate for an heir, Ferdinand married again, this time to Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony. But this marriage was a unique kind of torment. Maria Josepha was a deeply devout and sheltered woman who was horrified by the physical realities of marriage. It is said she believed that having children was an indecent act that could only be performed if you weren't married. For Ferdinand, a man obsessed with securing his dynasty, her refusal to consummate the marriage was a source of intense frustration and humiliation. He resorted to bizarre and cruel methods to try and change her mind. He subjected her to lectures from theologians and even sought the Pope's intervention to convince his own wife of her marital duties. The marriage remained unconsummated for years, a private battle of wills that only ended with Maria Josepha's early death from a fever. She died childless, leaving Ferdinand still without an heir. 3 wives, no surviving children. By now, Ferdinand was in his 40s and his health was failing. The pressure was immense. The fate of the Bourbon dynasty in Spain rested on his shoulders. So, he married for a 4th and final time. His choice was another niece, Maria Cristina of the Tussive. She was vibrant, pragmatic, and understood what was at stake. Unlike her predecessor, she did not shy away from her duty. Finally, Ferdinand's luck seemed to change. Maria Cristina quickly became pregnant, and in 1830, she gave birth to a healthy baby girl, Isabella. 2 years later, another daughter, Luisa Fernanda, was born. Ferdinand finally had children, but there was one huge problem. They were girls. Under Spanish Salic law, which had been in place for over a century, women could not inherit the throne if there were other male relatives in the line of succession. This meant that Ferdinand's rightful heir was not his daughter Isabella, but his younger brother, Don Carlos. Carlos was a staunch ultra-conservative, even more absolutist than Ferdinand himself. The liberals and moderate conservatives at court were terrified at the prospect of a King Carlos. They rallied around the infant Isabella, seeing her as the only hope for a more moderate future. They persuaded the aging and ailing Ferdinand to change the law of succession before Isabella was even born. Ferdinand had issued a pragmatic sanction, reviving an old Spanish law that allowed daughters to inherit the throne. This single act set the stage for civil war. Don Carlos and his supporters, though Carlos's, refused to accept this change. They saw it as an illegal betrayal of tradition and a direct attack on Carlos's birthright. As Ferdinand's health collapsed, the palace became a hotbed of conspiracy. While the king lay on his deathbed, slipping in and out of consciousness, the 2 factions fought for control. At one point, the Carloses managed to pressure the dying king into revoking the pragmatic sanction, briefly making Don Carlos the heir again. But Queen Maria Cristina was a formidable political player. As soon as the king regained a moment of clarity, she convinced him to reverse his decision once more. She purged the government of Carlos' supporters, and secured her daughter Isabella's place as the future queen. When Ferdinand VII finally died in 1833, he left behind a kingdom on the brink of collapse. Just days after his death, Don Carlos declared himself the legitimate king, and the First Carlist War began. This brutal civil war would tear Spain apart for 7 years, costing hundreds of thousands of lives. It was a fittingly chaotic end to a reign defined by betrayal, cruelty, and instability. Ferdinand VII's legacy is one of utter failure. He betrayed his allies, his people, and his country's hopes for progress. His paranoia turned the royal court into a nest of vipers. His cruelty shaped his marriages into sagas of suffering, and his obsession with an heir, combined with his willingness to manipulate the law, plunged his kingdom into a devastating war immediately upon his death. He is not remembered as the desired one, but as the king who set Spain back decades, a man whose personal darkness became a national tragedy. His life is a stark reminder of how the character of a single ruler can shape the destiny of millions, for better, or in his case, for much, much worse. The story of Ferdinand VII is a dark, twisted tale, a cautionary chapter in the history of power that deserves to be remembered. Thank you for watching. If you found this dive into one of history's darkest monarchs interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories you might not have learned in school. Let us know in the comments what other historical figures you'd like to see us cover. See you next time.